The world is changed. I feel it in the video. I feel it in the music. I hear it in the audio quality. Much that once was is lost, for few now live who picture this trilogy without seeing Elijah Wood and Orlando Bloom. It began with the forging of the adaptations. 3 were given to the animated features, incredible, charming, and wholesomest of all tales. 6 to Peter Jackson, a great visual storyteller of the Northern Island. And 9 video games in the last 10 years alone, who above all else imitated Jackson. For within these works was bound the image encoding to govern how people read the books. But they were all of them deceived, for another series was made. In the land of YouTube, in the fires of mediocrity, the obscure content creator Moth forged, in secret, a series to critique all others. And into this series he poured all his analysis, his research, and his will to improve representation. One series to school them all. Welcome back to The Source of the Rings, where we look at the science, codings, and real-life inspirations behind characters in the works of JRR Tolkien. After the unprecedented success of the first season, we return to Middle-earth. This year, rather than looking at The Hobbit, we'll be looking at its much more serious and much more successful successor, The Lord of the Rings. Well over 3 times as long as The Hobbit, and with way more characters, cultures, and regions at which to look, I've really got my work cut out for me. But, to start, I do have an idea. See, last year, I made some connections about 7 of the 9 members of the Fellowship. Gandalf, being a firework-using, wide-brimmed hat-wearing nomadic monk, shares some similarities to individuals in Tang Dynasty China. The Hobbits, being from the Shire and its surrounding areas, are coded as English, but while Frodo, Merry, and Pippin are described as pale, Sam, being described as brown, is not a surprise, as for centuries England had been a diverse place, something that Tolkien knew and incorporated into his writing. The dwarvish language of Khazd-dûl is structured much like Hebrew, and Tolkien himself made a comparison between the dwarves in exile and the Jewish diaspora. Finally, the elves of Mirkwood, such as Legolas, are the native elves reminiscent of the stories of indigenous Americans that Tolkien himself said he enjoyed as a boy. But what about Boromir and Aragorn? What elements of the real world can be found in Gondor and the descendants of the faithful? What did Tolkien think the subject of half of Return of the King looked like? Well, that's what we hope to answer today. Before we begin, though, 2 quick disclaimers. 1, I'm not saying that Tolkien wrote Gondor as an allegory for any real-world location, as anyone that knows anything about Tolkien knows how ridiculous that would be. I'm also not saying that any similarities are a one-to-one matchup, only that Tolkien, who admitted he was influenced by many sources, may have been influenced in a couple of ways that you haven't considered. 2, I'm not putting forth my interpretation of The Lord of the Rings as the right one. I've got support for my opinions, but as I'm not Tolkien myself, they're just still my opinions. If you prefer Jackson's plate armor-wearing, uniformly white, unrelated to Arnor, French architecture-inspired Gondor, I won't stop you, but this is just how I view it, based on what Tolkien wrote. Okay? Okay, let's begin. We can't talk about Gondor without first talking about Númenor. Now, to quickly simplify things, around 5,000 years before the War of the Ring, a group of men settled a large island off the west coast of Middle-earth. I don't want to spoil things too much for when I eventually get around to the Silmarillion, but the groups that settled were primarily from the House of Hador, a group of people that were described as fair-skinned, blonde, and blue-eyed, while a sizable minority were from the House of Beor, a typically dark-haired people that are described as having a wide range of skin tones, from pale to dark. There were also a handful of Druedain refugees, but I'll get to them in my video on the Druedain. Now, the majority of Númenor was settled by the Hadorians, but the western section was mostly Beorians, and those are the Númenorians in which we're interested. To make a long story short, the Númenóreans colonized a lot of Middle-earth, but messed things up, inadvertently helped Sauron gain power, and angered Manwë, king of the Valar, who I'll also get to eventually, resulting in the drowning of Númenor. The Faithful, a group of Western Númenóreans, respected the Valar and were able to survive, making their way to Middle-earth, where their leader, Elendil, became king. Now, as they moved to Middle-earth, Elendil and his sons were separated, and 2 separate kingdoms were established. Elendil in the north founded Arnor, and his sons, Anarion and Isildur, whom you may have heard of, founded Gondor. Eventually, the 3 and their people reunited, and through the union of the old Númenórean colonies run by the Faithful, as well as a number of civilizations of indigenous Middle-earthers, the North Kingdom and the South Kingdom, as they were called, became rather successful. United. 120 years later, though, Elendil and Anarion... Oh yeah, by the way, Númenóreans live way longer than normal humans. Anyways, they died during the War of the Last Alliance, leaving Isildur with responsibility over the 2 kingdoms. He named his nephew as the first solo king of Gondor, and tried to return to Arnor. While he was willing to be the High King of 2 kingdoms, like his father was, things didn't work so well for him, and he ended up dying before he could ever reach the capital. The 2 kingdoms were now independent of one another. Arnor lasted about 2,000 years before ultimately falling, which is great by our Earth standards, but considering that Middle-earth had immortals running societies, it's less impressive, while Gondor continued to the time of the War of the Ring, although the kingship had dissolved. By then, Gondor had changed drastically, with some land lost and some land gained. Since I'm here to mainly talk about Lord of the Rings, though, this is where I will focus. The War of the Ring saw Gondor unite as much of its power as it could, summoning the captains of the Outlands from the outskirts of Gondor to Minas Tirith for the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and the eventual reunion of the Rangers of the North, who were nomadic descendants of the Dúnedain of Arnor, with modern men of Gondor. One of these rangers, Aragorn, was crowned king, and he re-established Arnor, leading into a new age for Gondor that is mostly untold. Now, let's get into the physical descriptions. Gondor's known architecture was largely stone-based, with homes either being constructed out of stone, or, in the case of Minas Tirith and Minas Ithil, carved out of the sides of a mountain. Tall structures and stacked cities were common, and culturally, the colors of black, blue, white, silver, and gold were popular. Important symbols included the White Tree, the 7 stars, and the Crown of Gondor. The crown is actually one of the few things that Tolkien sketched out himself when somebody asked him about it, which I'll get to. Also in the peninsula of Dol Amroth, a swan boat is used as an emblem. As for the people, descriptions are varied, as would be expected given Gondor's culturally diverse origins. A few Gondorians, such as those of Dol Amroth or the families of the Stewards, are direct descendants of the Faithful, and described as looking like the Beorians, but many are of mixed ancestry, or entirely descended from the indigenous pre-Númenórean peoples of Gondor. So it's a spectrum. For example, the leader of the men of Penath Gulin, Herluin, is described as fair, possibly referring to his skin tone, as is often the case in Tolkien's writings. On the other end of the spectrum, Forlong the Old leads into Minas Tirith a well-received group of men from Lossarnach, a section of southern Gondor, who are explicitly described as being considerably swarthier than the rest of the men of Gondor Pippin had seen. For those who don't know, swarthy means dark skin. The people of Ithilien aren't really physically described, but while Éowyn was known as simply the Lady of Rohan while she lives in Rohan, when she moves to Ithilien, she is known to the people as the White Lady of Rohan, implying they're darker than the blonde-haired, pale Rohirrim. Finally, the Rangers of the North are contrarily described as being darker than the men of Bree, who are related to the dark-skinned Dunlendings, while also sometimes referred to as pale. Maybe pale refers to little blood flow in their face, maybe darker refers to, their demeanor. Who knows? All of that is to say that any depiction of Gondor as an all-pale monoculture is a direct contradiction of what the text itself describes. The Jackson trilogy cuts them out, but characters like Baragond, his son Birgil, Forlong, and Ioreth all have their origins in Lossarnach, and the people of Lossarnach are canonically dark-skinned. These people are also the majority of the soldiers present for the Battle of the Morannon. Yeah, that's the one at the Black Gate. Your Men of the West alt-right dog whistles are not based on Tolkien's writings. They're based on fanfiction that was published about 20 years ago. Look, there is plenty of racism in Tolkien's trilogy that I will get to this season, but even he himself despised the racialist identification racists tried to find in his story, as the people of Gondor were diverse. Okay, so with that out of the way, what real-world cultures may have influenced Tolkien in his creation of Gondor? Did anything maybe inspire him to create this cosmopolitan society of stoneworkers? Well, Tolkien himself quoted 3 main inspirations. Visually, Tolkien described Minas Tirith as a Byzantine city, and if you look at old sketches of Constantinople, you'll see why he would think that. Geographically, he compared Gondor to Italy, and said that the conclusion of the story would be akin to the restoration of the Holy Roman Empire. Then, thematically, in a letter to Ronald, an author that collaborated with him, he offered this: "The Númenóreans of Gondor were proud, peculiar, and archaic, and I think are best pictured in, say, Egyptian terms. In many ways they resembled Egyptians. The love of and power to construct, the gigantic and massive, and in their great interest in ancestry and in tombs, but not, of course, in theology, in which respect they were Hebraic and even more Puritan." End quote. I personally love this take, because as I put in more research, it actually bears some rather interesting parallels. Primarily, Númenor is pretty obviously inspired by Atlantis, something Tolkien himself recognized. Interestingly, though, Atlantis was, though likely a fictional invention by Plato, in the earliest and perhaps most recurring theories on where the Atlanteans ended up after its sinking, was ancient Egypt. Yeah, the ancient world thought that Atlanteans became Egyptians. Furthermore, Elendil's land being divided into 2 kingdoms over which he was High King is similar to how ancient Egypt was divided into the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, until Narmer unified them, just like Aragorn did. In fact, in that said letter, Tolkien recognizes this himself, and quotes his imagery as reflecting it. Quote, "I think the crown of Gondor, the southern kingdom, was very tall, like that of Egypt, but with wings attached, not set straight back, but at an angle. The north kingdom had only a diadem, the difference between the north and south kingdoms of Egypt." End quote. On top of this, if we look at Tolkien's sketch for the crown of Gondor, it indeed resembles the Peshent, a crown of Egypt made by combining the Hedjet of Upper Egypt and the Deshkret of Lower Egypt. I'm really sorry about all of these bad pronunciations, by the way. Again, as with most things, Gondor is Tolkien's invention, but it seems as though the greatest influence on its designs in terms of architecture, clothing, and culture was ancient Egypt. Going off from these 2 ideas, you can make a number of connections. Full disclosure, though, these ones aren't really supported by anything Tolkien said inspired him, but were links I found interesting nonetheless. The Argonath, being 2 giant statues of kings, is reminiscent of the Colossi of Memnon, the largest twin statues of which I know. The Rangers of the North, being nomadic horse riders that guard borders to protect the people, serve the same purpose that the Bedouin guards served to the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and that they served to Justinian while in the Sinai Peninsula. The dark-skinned men of Lossarnach being the most talented warriors despite being mostly farmers is similar how to the Medjay, an initially pastoral Nubian people group, were so talented that they ended up becoming the elite paramilitary force for the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Dol Amroth, a peninsula with an important hill whose founder, Imrazor, had his name based on Hebrew, is akin to the Sinai Peninsula, which is in Egypt, famous for its Mount Sinai, which is important in Hebrew history. Both peninsulas also produce talented harp players, and I could keep going. The southern Gondorians of Blackroot Vale are talented archers, much like the Nubians who lived in southern Egypt were the most talented archers for their time. Belfalas has a constant wind on it, just like the northern coast of Egypt, although I guess that's kind of a stretch, and Ithilien compares to Waset, both being the land of the moon, so on and so forth. But, obviously, these are less than conjecture. They're just me using what I know of in the real world to envision how Middle-earth may have looked. But that's the exact same step that every adapter of these works takes, as there aren't sketches and letters from Tolkien on everything. Bakshi's Aragorn is coded as Native American, and given how Numenor was the origin of corn and tobacco, I can see why that's the route they took. Peter Jackson's version of Gondor was inspired largely by Roman culture, and as Tolkien equated Gondor and Rome, I get that. So there are plenty of ways you can look at it. My interpretation, just like the ones of others, is my own, but it's valid, and that's a big point of this series. The gatekeeping engineered to keep fans that envision Middle-earth differently than the norm out of discussions has led to racist harassment of fans of color and demonization of anybody that thinks that The Last Alliance might not have looked like the European fantasy some other fans desire. So these videos, on top of being a really fun way for me to enjoy the original stories again, on top of being an interesting look into how stories are crafted, are also a way for this white man to use his privilege and say, no, casting actors with Middle Eastern or African ancestry as good guys in the Amazon Prime series is not spitting on Tolkien's grave, although the money being made going to line the pockets of the wealthiest man alive maybe. And no, a black man being a good guy in a video game would not have disgusted Tolkien, although the fact that his story is being used as set dressing for blood and gore simulators might. And no, fans that headcanon or interpret their favorite characters as looking differently than you expect them to are not forcing diversity on you. They're just enjoying the series. Again, as we'll get to, Tolkien had lots of problems with race, but he encouraged people that saw his works through different cultural lenses to enjoy them. He shared the Japanese edition of The Hobbit with one of his close friends, and he complimented the works of Cor Bloch, an artist that saw members of the Fellowship as having dark skin. Tolkien had a huge racist problem, but also Tolkien fandom has a racist problem, and in some cases, it's even worse than Tolkien's. So consider this a bit of a pushback against that trend. As I wrap up, another fantastic pushback against this trend, Elyanna Choi at Itariales, sorry if I mispronounced that, is a fantastically talented artist and analyst that has been making waves in the Tolkien fandom. She wrote about her experience as a panel member at Tolkien 2019, as well as collects a master post about racism in Tolkien's work, as well as Tolkien fandom, both of which I've linked below. She also happens to be an amazing artist and made a piece of art that was partially inspired by my first video in the series, featuring a Chinese-inspired Gandalf, so of course I like that. She's someone whose work I wholeheartedly recommend, and someone I look forward to seeing more from in the future. As with last season, if there's something you'd like to see me cover from The Lord of the Rings, let me know down below. Or if there's something about Gondor that reminds you of the real world that I didn't mention, leave a comment. Lastly, if you'd like me to share some of your artwork representing a more diverse Middle-earth inspired by Tolkien's codings, please feel free to post a link. Thank you for watching.